Welcome back to the program. The shooting of an unarmed black teenager and the subsequent riots have made headlines around the world. To discuss the problems facing the African-American community, we have Craig Watkins, a district attorney in Texas. Joining us from Boston, we have Peniel Joseph, a university professor and commentator on African-American issues. And with me on set, we have journalist and scholar Clayton Powell III. Thank you all for joining us. Can we start with you, Craig Watkins? I know you all have very different ideas about the challenges here. You've announced an independent investigative unit in Dallas, Texas, to look into police shootings. Why have you done that? And do you think this will solve the problem?
Well, I think it's a first step in us making credibility for the law enforcement community. Unfortunately, over the years, law enforcement has lost credibility with certain communities, especially the African-American community. I'm African-American. I get to be the district attorney in Dallas County, and so I feel it's my responsibility to endear those individuals who don't trust law enforcement back to law enforcement. I don't think that the ideology that certain individuals have about law enforcement is wrong. I mean, we've seen historically that it hadn't worked for certain communities, especially the African-American community. And so this is our opportunity, what's going on in Ferguson, Texas, or Ferguson, Missouri, and even here in Dallas County, for us to take advantage of this opportunity to make things work for all individuals.
Mr. Watkins, you basically said this is a national problem and you doing what you can in Texas to tackle it. Peniel Joseph, you say that what we've seen on the streets of Ferguson is, in some result, a lack of leadership among young African Americans. But given that we have an African American in the White House, President Obama, an African American Attorney General who's on the streets of Ferguson recently, there is leadership there, correct?
Well, what I meant by leadership is that there's a generational divide in terms of civil rights struggles in the United States. And there's also a class divide. So when we think about Eric Holder, when we think about President Obama, these are leaders at the national level, but they're representing a certain class. When we think about Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton as well, they have access. They're certainly advocating for social justice. But I'm talking about the young people who were throwing Molotov cocktails, who were angry about the police murder of Michael Brown, who are angry about racial segregation, who are angry about poverty and terrible public schools. It's how do you reach them? And from that perspective, Obama and Eric Holder have an incredible amount of work to do. So it's not a lack of leadership per se by young people. It's saying that young people have opted out. They are on the margins. They're dispossessed. They're what Americans at times call a racial underclass, who are more likely to go to parole and prison and probation than to really have access to educational and economic opportunities.
Adam, I'd like to pick up on what Peniel Joseph just said. Your father was the first African-American in New York to be elected to office. There was a lot of hope that political power would translate into economic opportunity. That really hasn't necessarily happened for African-Americans across this country. Why is that?
Well, it has happened for some.
But not many. Right?
If you look at the numbers, at its worst a few years ago, the unemployment rate among young African-American men was 49%. Yeah. Wow, 49%. That's remarkable. And so it does, as the professor said, divide along class lines, divide along age lines. But it also, he talks about the lack of leadership. There's something else going on, which Attorney General Holder doesn't talk about. President Obama touched on it in a speech recently, which is that in this group of young African-American men, you have an extraordinarily, not just high unemployment, but high rate of criminal prosecution, criminal conviction, and incarceration. You're talking about African-Americans are, what, 13% of the population of the United States. African-American men would be about 6% of the population of the United States. You're talking about 2 or 3% of the United States, and yet half of the murder victims in the United States are young African-American men killed by other young African-American men.
You touched on a really interesting point here. I want to bring up some figures for everyone. Let's take Ferguson as this example. Out of the population of 21,000 in Ferguson, 65% of the population is African American, but only 6% of the police officers are African American, and 21% of the families living in Ferguson, majority African American, are below the poverty line. Let me speak to Craig Watkins, because you're in law enforcement. Should the police force of Ferguson and other places reflect the racial mix of the society that they are there to serve and protect? And if so, how can we bring this about?
I think it's more of a cultural issue. When you're policing individuals with a certain culture, it would absolutely help if those individuals that are policing came from that same culture so they can understand certain issues and ideologies. Unfortunately, in Ferguson, Missouri, you don't see that. And it's very surprising when you have so many individuals of color that live there, and you don't have any leadership within that community that look like their community. It's unfortunate that that happens, and so we really need to take a close look at communities like that all over the country to make sure that the culture, not just because of color, but the culture represents the individuals that live there.
But with all due respect, I think that's a long-term solution. There are things we know, the things we know how to do today. There should be better training. The idea that a law enforcement officer who is armed can't deal with an unarmed individual, even if he is, 300 pounds, large individual, you should be trained to do that. Second, what's coming out, and today both the New York Times and the Washington Post finally did stories about it, there are these small body cameras which are being made available. And whenever police use these small body cameras, what we've seen is quite striking. Plunge in the use of deadly force, plunge in community complaints.
Can I also ask another question, because I want to get to the heart of the racial discrimination that's felt on the streets of Ferguson and across the US. We've seen rioting, we've seen some violence. Is that an expression of people who have no other voice, or is this criminality? The White House seems to have a problem here. Peniel.
I want to jump in here. This is not rioting per se. When we think about the 1960s, we saw massive racial riots in places like Detroit, Los Angeles, and Newark, New Jersey. But what we really saw was hundreds of civil disturbances in over 200 American cities that were sparked by police confrontations with local black communities. So one, that's what you have here. You had some incidences of violence, but this was not full-blown rioting. The contradiction here is that the Ferguson authorities confronted local black citizens as if it was a full-blown riot. So Ferguson police acted like it was Detroit in 1967. The governor eventually called in the National Guard. But when we really look at what's going on there, the on-the-ground reporting, there were peaceful demonstrations, then there was some violence, there was some looting, but it was not a full-blown riot. Now, when we think about what's going on here, institutional racism is at the core of the anger. And Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said violence and rioting was the language of the unheard, right? So what we've seen 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, this is the anniversary, is continued racial segregation, continued poor public schools, a public school to prison pipeline, unemployment and underemployment, and to top it all off, we've seen racial denial at the national level. Because when we look at the stats, and there's a new book called Black Stats by Monique Morris, when we look at the stats of African Americans and social economic indicators, they are worse than anybody really truthfully acknowledges, both in terms of positive social economic indicators, the number of us who are in corporate America, higher education, business, law enforcement, and then those of us who are disproportionately represented in negative social economic indicators, everything from mental illness, lack of health care access, bankruptcy, residential segregation, unemployment.
Mr. Joseph, I want to get everyone in on this point because you've opened up a lot here. We have Barack Obama in the White House. What can American policy do about this in the short term? You're talking about this crisis. Can I hear from you, Craig Watkins, first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that we have an African American president who brings a different perspective to the country. However, you have to understand that institutional racism is hard to overcome, and it takes time. He can only be the president for 8 years, but we've had presidents for centuries that have implemented those policies, and so it's going to be more than just Barack Obama on his own in 8 years trying to change this country, and so the strategy is basically for us to get folks to vote, for us to get folks to put people in office that are different than what we've seen historically.
Adam Powell, is that the solution? Get people to vote?
I'd like to pick up a thread, which is education.
Sure.
That's absolutely critical, and is something which both Democrats and Republicans find difficult to deal with, because it is a system which has year after year, decade after decade, 50 years after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, many more years after Brown versus the Board of Education, still consistently produces failure among young black men in central cities. And that is just unacceptable. You should say that is unacceptable as a nation and do something about it. We know how to fix that. It's just difficult to face politically.
Education is the start for you. Adam Powell, thank you very much. Peniel Joseph, also thank you. And Craig Watkins, thank you also from Dallas. That's it for this edition of The Hill. Love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And to continue the conversation, join us on Facebook at CCTV America. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.